All right. Good morning, everyone. I've got 10 o'clock on my computer, so we'll go ahead and get started. So welcome to this month's professional in-service training. We are lucky enough to have Stacy Bevan presenting for us today. She is a professor in the Nutrition, Dietetics, and Food Sciences department here at USU. But I'll let her introduce herself a little bit more. Just a reminder, if you haven't already, to put your name and county in the chat box, so that way we can keep roll that way. And if you're watching this training later on the Food Sense YouTube channel, please make sure that you email Jocelyn after you've watched it to let her know that you've watched it. So with that, I'll turn the time over to Stacy.
Okay, well, thank you. Let me hurry and pull up my screen here. Oops, sorry. Okay. All right, so can everyone hear me? Okay. Hopefully. Okay. Well, like Caleb said, my name is Stacy Bevan, and I am a professional practice associate professor in the Department of Nutrition, Dietetics, and Food Science here at Utah State University. And I teach 2 undergraduate courses. I teach a class called Food Literacy, which is kind of a culinary basics with an emphasis of farm to fork. And then I also teach a class called the Science of Food Preparation. It's kind of an introduction to food science. And most of my students are dietetics, and well, about half, and then half are family and consumer science education students. So, but I was asked to do this presentation. I did something similar recently at a FACS conference. And so I'm always excited because I get really passionate about eggs. I think eggs are fascinating, and they can play an important part in our diet, but they play a really big part in food cookery as well. So just kind of an overview of where I'm headed today. Make sure my thing's moving forward here. We're going to talk about the role of eggs as part of a healthy diet. We're going to talk about egg cholesterol and heart health. We'll talk about egg structure and composition, egg evaluation and safety. And I'm not so sure we'll have too much time to talk about functional properties of eggs and cooking examples, but I'll briefly just touch on those just to give you some ideas of things that we can do with eggs. So just to kind of start out with, the consumption of fowl or bird eggs has really began a long time ago. About 3200 BC is when it was believed that people started eating bird eggs. And Christopher Columbus, it's believed that he brought chickens to the Americas on his second trip to the Americas around 1493, and it's those chickens that we've now domesticated and we use for eggs. Now, there's a variety of other animals that lay eggs. There's ducks, turkeys, wild birds, turtles, penguins, crocodiles, probably more than that. But since chicken eggs are primarily what we consume, that we're most familiar with, that's what we're going to talk about today. So eggs are one of the most popular breakfast foods, and they have been described as the perfect food. And I'd be happy if anyone wants to unmute or put into chat or whatever, why do you think that eggs are titled as the perfect food? And I don't even have chat pulled up here, so I'm like, let me see if I can find chat. I'm not familiar enough to figure out how to get back to chat. So if you put it in there, I appreciate it. Someone gonna unmute. Okay.
I'll read, if anybody puts any questions in the chat, I can read them out.
Okay, that's perfect. All right, thank you. Well, I'll just go ahead and just tell you some ideas that I've come up with. So eggs are extremely easy to cook. They're inexpensive. And really, if you think about it, if you are hungry, you can put an egg on the stovetop. You don't have to have a lot of skill. And 5 minutes later, if you're just scrambling or frying an egg, you could have your dinner. They are extremely versatile. So if we think about what you can do with breakfast and eggs, there's crepes, there's casseroles, French toast, pancakes, muffins. You can fry an egg, you can scramble it, you can turn it into an omelet, a frittata. The list goes on and on. We can use eggs as binders. So a lot of times we dip our meat or whatever, an egg first, and then we put our breading on it, or you can use it to bind like meatballs. We can use eggs as leaveners by whipping the egg whites into a foam and using those for meringues or souffles or angel food cakes, sponge cakes, fluffy waffles, right? We can hard cook eggs. We can use them as emulsifiers to help our sauces stay together. So with like mayonnaise and hollandaise sauce, cake batters. So the list goes on and on. We can use eggs for so many different applications. They're extremely versatile. And then they're really nutrient dense as well. So the great thing about eggs is they're in their own little package. And in one large egg, it's only about 70 calories. And you're getting a lot of nutrition. You're getting about 6 grams of protein. You are getting 5 grams of fat, but if we want to break that fat down, only about 33% of that is saturated fat, and the rest is mono and polyunsaturated fats. It's one of the few foods that naturally contain vitamin D, and so but you do need to eat the yolk in order to get that vitamin D. It also contains biotin, other important vitamins and minerals like folate and arginine. And then it contains a nutrient called choline, which is a nutrient that sometimes we don't talk too much about, but choline is a micronutrient that we need to break down break down fats to produce energy. It helps us to maintain our cell membranes. It's important for pregnant and lactating women for fetal brain development. And a lot of people don't get enough choline. And eggs have the most choline more than any other single food. So it's a great source of choline. But again, you've got to consume the yolk in order to get that choline. So if we kind of break down, I don't know, it's kind of a delayed to the next slide. If we kind of break down and look at the whites compared to the yolks, a lot of times people are like, just eat the white because then you don't have to worry about any fat, and most of the fat is in the yolk, so you would have a fairly fat-free product if you just ate the white, and you would avoid all the cholesterol because all of that's in the yolk. But you do lose some important nutrients if you don't eat the yolk. You lose that vitamin D, you lose that choline, you lose most of that vitamin A, and so there are nutrients that are lost when you choose to not eat the yolk.
Stacy, here's a question in the chat
okay.
from Michelle in Box Elder County. Does it make a difference if the yolk is runny or hard to get all the nutrients?
That's a good question. I don't really think so. Well, I will take that back. So biotin, there is a protein in eggs it's called avidin, and it's in the egg whites, and it will bind up biotin if the eggs are not cooked. But as long as you're cooking the eggs, then it breaks down that protein or denatures that protein, and so you're able to get biotin in your diet. So to get biotin, it's better not to eat raw eggs. It's better to eat cooked eggs, if that makes sense. As far as the other nutrients, I haven't heard anything otherwise as far as raw versus cooked. So good question. So let's talk a little bit about cholesterol and heart health when it comes to eggs. Eggs have, and again, it's just in the yolk, there's about 185 milligrams per large egg yolk of cholesterol. During the 1950s, we in America were at an all-time high for consuming eggs. We consumed about 389 eggs per person per year. So that's about 8 eggs per week. And then following that time period, there were some studies that came out that kind of connected cholesterol and cardiovascular disease. And so when that connection was made, a lot of different organizations started recommending that we reduce our dietary consumption of dietary cholesterol. And so we saw organizations starting to give recommendations to limit dietary cholesterol. In the amount of eggs that people were consuming per person per year. And since that time, our understanding of cholesterol and heart health has advanced a little bit. There's still questions out there, but consumption has gone up a little bit. And I know this is a little dated, 2009. And I did look to see if I could find any more recent data, and I couldn't find anything great. But from what I saw, it's gone up a little bit, but it's still not anywhere near the consumption of the 1950s. So we are still eating less eggs than we did in the past. When we look at
Stacy,
current... Oh, do you have another question? Yeah.
I'm not sure if your slides are advancing. We're just still on the first slide.
Oh, you are? Oh, I don't know what's going on. Oh, it says my screen sharing is paused. So how do I unpause it? Oh, I'm sorry. I don't know what I hit. Is that better?
Yep, we can.
Sorry, I can slide. I'll see if I can go back. No, it's not letting me.
There we go.
Okay, sorry that you didn't see all of this. So here you can see the nutrition facts label since you didn't get to see that. And then this is kind of the breakdown between egg whites and egg yolks. So again, you can kind of see what's in the yolk versus the white. And I'm sorry, this is rushed through. And then here's the stats for cholesterol consumption, or sorry, eggs consumption based on year. So I'm just going to skip to this slide. So the current egg consumption recommendations by different organizations are listed here. And prior to 2014, the Dietary Guidelines for Americans, as well as the American Heart Association, they had a limit, and they recommended that if you were heart healthy, then you should limit your dietary cholesterol intake to less than 300 milligrams per day, and then avoid any other cholesterol containing foods. So that would be really any other animal-based products, because all animal products have cholesterol in it. So, and then also trying to limit your saturated fat and trans fat. And then they said if you had high cholesterol levels or high LDL levels, then you should limit your consumption to less than 200 milligrams per day, and then again avoid any other cholesterol in your diet. So if you ate one egg per day and you had high LDL cholesterol levels, that was it for you pretty much on your cholesterol levels, because one egg is 185 milligrams. So forget any other animal-based products, you're pretty much at your level there. As of 2014, the American Heart Association dropped that upper level, and now they have no specific recommendation, and they just emphasize eating just an overall healthy diet with fruits and vegetables, whole grains, low-fat dairy products, pretty much just an overall healthy diet. In the 2015 to 2020 Dietary Guidelines for Americans, which are the current ones, they also removed that upper level of where they say you should limit your cholesterol intake. And now they just say, again, eat a healthy diet, but also try to eat as little dietary cholesterol as possible. And so they don't say how much cholesterol, they just say try to limit your cholesterol intake. The therapeutic lifestyle change diet, TLC diet, which is specific to people with high cholesterol, they're still saying limit your dietary cholesterol to less than 200 milligrams per day. And then the DASH diet is saying, eggs are high in cholesterol, so limit them to no more than 4 per week. Now, it's interesting to compare these recommendations that are in the U.S. to recommendations in other countries. So the British Heart Foundation, they state that it's a myth that eggs are bad for your heart. The National Heart Foundation of Australia encourages consuming or enjoying up to 6 eggs per week as part of a balanced diet. And the Danish Heart Association, they tell you to enjoy eggs as part of a balanced diet, but they do warn you that the yolk is high in fat and cholesterol. So there are differences between countries on recommendations when it comes to eggs. If we look in the literature, so peer-reviewed literature, what we're finding is kind of interesting, I think. And it's really kind of a shift from what we've heard in the past with eggs, this fear of consuming too many eggs. So this first study that I kind of pulled out for you was a multi-ethnic group. And so they had 40% males, 60% Hispanics, 20% blacks, and 18% whites. And they were all elderly, 66 years of age and older for the most part. And what they looked at is they looked at the amount of eggs they consumed and how that was connected to their carotid atherosclerosis, so plaque presence, plaque thickness, and total plaque area. And so they found that those that consume less than 1 egg per month compared to the groups that were consuming the most eggs, greater than 2 eggs per week, there really wasn't a difference. The low to moderate egg consumption was not associated with an increase in the carotid atherosclerosis, and actually increasing their egg consumption was associated with a decreased risk of having plaque. And so the authors of this study stated that, healthy people, eggs are not associated with cardiac risk, and it might actually be protective against stroke. They also indicated in this article that when we consume eggs, they promote larger particle sizes of cholesterol. So the LDL cholesterol that they might contribute to, they're larger, so they're, again, less atherosclerosis. I can't even say that word, but you know what I'm saying. And then they also promote the formation of HDL cholesterol, so your good cholesterol. So they're saying that there could be some heart health benefits to consuming eggs. The next study was a review study, and they really looked at both intervention studies and observation studies. And in the intervention studies, they found in the high quality intervention studies, there really wasn't any evidence to restrict egg consumption below 2 eggs per day. So they were saying if you're eating 2 eggs per day, you're healthy, or if you have type 2 diabetes, which is important because a lot of the past studies have said, if you're healthy, yeah, you're fine, but if you had diabetes or risk for cardiovascular disease, that's where you really need to cut back. But this study showed in the intervention studies, there was no difference. So whether you had type 2 diabetes or you're healthy, there was no increased risk for cardiovascular disease or type 2 diabetes. When they looked at the observational studies, they did see some increased risk for cardiovascular disease, but the authors also indicated that these studies did not control for other lifestyle factors that can affect your cardiovascular disease risk. So they mentioned that maybe if people were eating a larger amount of eggs in their diet, they were also eating other unhealthy things. So maybe they're pairing those eggs with bacon, which are high in saturated fat, or they didn't control for trans fat and overall saturated fat in their diet, which are generally bigger risk factors for cardiovascular disease than dietary cholesterol. As well as, I mean, they didn't really look at the consumption of mono and polyunsaturated fatty acids, which have been shown to lower your risk of cardiovascular disease as well. So the overall takeaway from this study is that up to 7 eggs per week, so 1 per day, is safe whether you're healthy or if you have cardiovascular disease or type 2 diabetes, but they do emphasize that you should be trying to follow a healthy lifestyle pattern while consuming those eggs if you choose to consume 7 per week. Just a couple, oh, yep.
There's a question in the chat from Heather in Carbon County. And she asked, is there a nutritional difference and cholesterol difference between chicken eggs versus duck eggs?
Oh, that is a good question, and I have not looked into the content of duck eggs. But I always could, and I could send out the answer after this presentation if you want me to. As far as I know, when it comes to, let me just grab my since I don't forget right now. I know that when it comes to chicken versus duck meat tends to be much higher in fat than chicken meat. But as far as eggs go, I don't know. So that's a good question. I'll look into it, and I will send the response after the presentation that can be emailed out. Any other questions? We're good. Okay, so this next, just 2 other studies I wanted to point out. This next one I thought was really interesting. They had 140 participants, and it was in the journal of the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, which is a pretty prominent journal. And they had 140 participants, and the participants either had prediabetes or type 2 diabetes, and then a BMI greater than 25. And they divided these 140 participants into 2 groups. One group they assigned a high egg diet, so they had to eat 2 eggs per week, 6 days a week, so 12 eggs per week they were consuming for 3 whole months. And then the other group was assigned a low egg diet, so they ate less than 2 eggs per week, but they had to replace the protein that they would have got from the eggs with a lean animal protein. So 10 grams of lean animal protein at breakfast where they would have had the eggs. And then both groups were encouraged to limit the saturated and trans fat in their diets and eat more poly and monounsaturated fats. And they found at the end of this study, that there was absolutely no difference between the groups that were eating 12 eggs per week versus the groups that were eating less than 2 eggs per week. There was no difference in their HDL cholesterol, their total cholesterol, their LDL cholesterol, or their triglycerides. And that's a big difference in egg consumption between the two groups. And they actually found that the egg group that was eating 12 eggs per week indicated that they were more satisfied and less hungry after breakfast. And so the authors kind of concluded that perhaps eggs could help with weight maintenance as well, because people were more satisfied and less hungry when they were eating these eggs. The last study, the PREDIMED study, was a large population study. It had 7,216 participants. They all lived in Spain. They were all elderly. About 50% of them had diabetes, but they all had high cardiovascular disease risk. And they all followed a Mediterranean diet. And what they found, again, with the groups that ate less than 2 eggs per week versus the groups that, as they went up to greater than 4 eggs per week, at baseline, the higher egg consumption was not associated with cardiovascular disease, and they did not have any increase in the cardiovascular disease risk as they went up in egg consumption. So when we look at all of these studies, what we conclude from them is maybe eggs aren't really the big effect on our heart health. It's really lowering your saturated fat and trans fat in your diet and increasing your poly and monounsaturated fats. That's going to have the greater effect at preventing cardiovascular disease than consuming eggs. So we can see that in the most recent dietary guidelines. They basically state, there's not enough evidence available to give us a limit on dietary cholesterol. And when they look specifically at eggs, so egg yolks and shellfish, they say they're high in dietary cholesterol, but not saturated fat. And so they can be consumed along with a variety of other choices. They don't give us a limit. And so from all these studies, really, it looks like eating 1 to 2 eggs per day is not likely going to be detrimental to your overall health. And you should focus on your mono and polyunsaturated fats and lowering the saturated and trans fats in your diets instead of worrying about how many eggs you're consuming per day. All right, so we're going to kind of switch over now and talk a little bit about egg formation. And I always find this very fascinating, how eggs are formed and how quickly they're formed. So hens are born with one functioning ovary. And in that ovary, they have thousands of germ cells. And as they are reaching their laying age, which is around 4 to 6 months, there is fat and protein that is being deposited on those germ cells. And so once a germ cell has reached maturity, it is a complete yolk. And you can kind of see that in this picture. I don't know if you can see my thing right there, right here, which looks kind of gross, but you can see the process here. So once the yolk is formed, there is a membrane that surrounds it called the vitelline membrane that keeps that yolk kind of intact. And then it's released into what's called the oviduct, which is this long tube, which is about 2 feet in length, a little bit longer depending on the chicken. And when it first enters that first area called the infundibulum, it's only there for about 15 minutes. And it's at this point, if sperm makes contact with that yolk, then that yolk will be fertilized and it could develop into a baby chick. Most eggs that we buy at the grocery store have never had the chance to be fertilized. And so if it's ever been a concern that, that would have been a baby chick, it wouldn't. So chickens, just like female humans, ovulate. They ovulate, obviously, much more frequently than we do, but they're going to release that egg, whether it's fertilized or not. So it's there for about 15 minutes, and then it moves to the next area. And in that magnum region, that's where a lot of the egg white is deposited, the thick albumin. And here, it spends a little bit longer, about 3 hours, and then it moves into the isthmus region, and here the inner and outer shell membrane is deposited, and that's just a membrane that coats the outside of the egg white, and then it's kind of adjacent to the egg or the shell. And then it moves into a little bit more egg whites deposited. It moves into the uterus region, and here there are mineral secreting cells in the uterus that secrete calcium carbonate, and that forms the shell. The pigment's also deposited on the shell. And then there's also, that's kind of the final thing, a layer goes on the shell called the cuticle, which is really a protective layer that kind of seals the pores in the shell to kind of protect from bacteria getting into the egg. And then the egg is released through the cloaca, or some people call it the vent. And that whole process takes about 25 to 26 hours. And then 30 minutes to 75 minutes later, another yolk is released into the oviduct and the whole process starts again. So that's a lot of work happening in about a day's time. So if you've ever had children, I'm pregnant right now, so I'm like, this seems exhausting, but they're doing it about every day, which is pretty incredible, and they're pretty efficient at it. So if during this whole process, if there is a blood vessel that ruptures in the ovary or along the oviduct, then you might see these little blood spots in your egg. And it's not anything to be overwhelmed or scared about. It's not going to make you sick if you consume it. And a lot of times if they're really small, you can just take the tip of a knife and kind of remove it from your egg. A lot of times these eggs are removed during inspection, and so we don't really see them when we buy them, but occasionally you'll get one. And I know one time I had read about it, talked about it in my classes, and I had an egg that had a little blood spot in it. So I'm like, it's not that big of a deal. And a lot of books will say it's a sign of freshness because there's a lot of moisture in the egg. And so as the egg ages, the blood spot kind of dissolves in there. So I'm like, it's not a big deal. I'm just going to incorporate it into the batter. I can't remember, I was making a cake or something. And it turned my whole entire batter pink, which was disgusting. So I will be wise about how much blood spot there might be on your egg. And if it's enough to make your batter turn pink, then maybe just use a different egg and avoid using that egg altogether. If the eggs are going to be used for liquid egg products, so a lot of times you can buy pasteurized eggs that are in cartons, or eggs that might be converted into egg beaters where the yolk's removed and they add other things to it. Any kind of liquid egg product, then it's going to go through a washing and sanitizing process to ensure that any kind of microbes that are on the surface of the shell, any spoilage bacteria that might be on the surface of the shell is removed. And so they go along this conveyor belt with these brushes and sprayed with about 90-degree Fahrenheit water. Then it's sprayed with an alkaline solution of pH of 11, so that kills a lot of the bacteria. Then it's rinsed again with warm water, and then it's usually sprayed with a chlorine solution to help sanitize it. And then after they are washed and sanitized, they are inspected through a process called candling. And candling really helps them to identify any cracks that are in the eggs, dirt stuck to it, any deformations in the shell, if there's blood spots or meat spots inside the egg, and then also identifying how big the air cell is and how thick that thick white is. So you can do this picture here, I don't know if you can see right at the very top, you can see a thin line on both of these, and it's a little bit lighter at the top here. That is the air cell. So as an egg ages or loses quality, that air cell increases in size. So that's one thing that they'll see when they're candling, is they're looking for the size of that air cell. The other thing that you'll notice is that you can vaguely see the yolk in the center of these, but as the egg goes down in quality, it's much easier to see the egg yolk. And that has to do with the thick white, which is the part of the white that stays much more viscous, stands up taller when you crack the egg. As the egg ages, that degrades and becomes less distinguishable, and so you can see through that shell and see to the yolk a lot easier. And so that's another indicator of quality. As it goes down, you'll see that more readily. Now, if you're at home, this is a really fun activity, even for grown-ups. I'm sure it's in things for little elementary kids, but I find it very fascinating too. You can just take a flashlight and an egg at home and kind of rotate it around, and you'll be able to see this in your eggs at home. And then again, if it's going to be used for a liquid egg product, they will use these machines to break the eggs, and they break 140,000 eggs per hour. So they're very efficient, and once those eggs are cracked, the shells are removed, they can further inspect them, and if there's any kind of defects to the eggs, then they will remove them. So a quick trivia question, and again, you can just guess in your own head because I can't really see your comments, but most eggs make it to the grocery store in how much time? I was really surprised by this, but actually most make it to the store in 24 hours. So it's a pretty quick turnaround from when they are laid to when we access them in the grocery store. Now, how long they stay in the grocery store, I guess that's another question. But, grocery stores are one way to access eggs. And then there are a lot of co-ops now, a lot of local producers that advertise local eggs, or you can get them from your farmer's market as well. So we're going to talk a little bit about the parts of the egg as well. So the main parts that we often think about, of course, is the shell, the yolk, and the white, and we'll talk about those and then briefly talk about some of the other parts that you might see in the egg. The yolk makes up about 31% of the weight of the egg, and it contains almost all the fat, contains all the cholesterol, a lot of vitamins and minerals like iron, zinc, and if the egg was fertilized, it basically contains the majority of the nutrients that a developing chick would need to grow and survive. The color of the yolk can vary. It can be anywhere from a dark yellow to a pale yellow, and that really has to do with the diet of the hen. So if the hen is eating a lot of grass, it's eating yellow corn, yellow maize, and even some people will feed their chickens marigold petals. That will give the yolk more xanthophyll, which is a fat-soluble pigment, which makes it a dark orange color, which some people feel seems like it's more nutritious, but really it's just that there's more of that fat-soluble vitamin in there, and there's no other difference in the nutritional content of the egg. If the chicken's eating just more like white corn and there's other grains they might feed them, then it tends to be a little bit more pale yellow in color. And so that's why you might see a difference in color. At the very center of the yolk, and if you look very carefully, you have to pay attention when you're cracking it, you might see a little white dot. That's known as the germinal disc, or some people call it the white yolk. And if that egg was fertilized, that would be where the embryo would start to grow and develop from that point. The white, there's actually two parts to the white. So there's this part here, this is called the thick white or the thick albumin, and then this one that surrounds it is called the thin white or thin albumin. So this thick white stands up taller and is more compact, stays closer to the yolk when you crack your egg, and then as an egg ages, it starts to disintegrate and it's less distinguishable from that thin white. And then the shell, and then of course the whites contain a lot of proteins and other nutrients. It contains the sulfur. That's where we get the sulfurous smell from eggs. And some of the proteins are antimicrobial, which is important. When it comes to the shell looks solid, but it is very porous. It could have up to 17,000 pores in it, which means air and carbon dioxide can come in and out of the shell. Moisture can come in and out of the shell. Bacteria can get into the shell. And so that's why that cuticle layer is so important as that last step when the egg is laid, because it creates this protective barrier from things getting into those pores. Now, there are a variety of different things that could damage that cuticle, and bacteria could still get in. So abrasive cleaners, scrubbing it can damage that cuticle. If you take that egg that's freshly been laid and put it in water that is cooler than that, it could suck it in through the pores, and so bacteria can still get in that way. So you have to be careful with it. The shell color can range from a variety of different colors, and I think for a while it was kind of trendy that the brown eggs, sometimes people associate them with more organic, and so they think, oh, brown is more nutritious, when that's not the case at all. So really there is no difference in the nutrition of the egg based on the color of the shell. So the nutrition content's the same, the cooking quality is the same, all of that. The only difference that comes with the color is that they come from different breeds of chickens. And in one book I read, and I don't have chickens, so you guys can test this for yourself if you have chickens, but it said that chickens have tufts of feathers over their ears, and if you lift those up and look at the color of the ear is the color of the egg that they will lay, which I thought was interesting. So, but that's your shell. A few other parts that you've probably seen when you've cracked open an egg is the shell membranes. So I mentioned that in part of the oviduct, an outer and inner shell membrane is placed around the whites. And you can see it in this top picture here. And probably most often when you see this is when you hard cook an egg and you're peeling that shell, it kind of gets stuck. It looks kind of like a plasticky layer. And those just go surrounding the white and are immediately adjacent to the shell, and they're connected everywhere except for the very bottom of the egg where you have that air cell. That's where they're separated. But again, they just act as another layer of protection against bacteria getting into that egg. The chalaza, do you have a question? Sorry.
Oh yeah, there was a question, jumping back to the egg color from Lindsay in Salt Lake County. Is it true that they bleach the white eggs?
Well, I know during the cleaning process they do use a chlorine solution, but I think that's more for sanitizing and not necessarily for bleaching. But I haven't read too much on that, but I can definitely look into that too and send that as a further response after this presentation. Okay, good questions. This other part, excuse me, is called the chalaza, and there's actually two of them on each side of the yolk. They're connected to that vitelline membrane, or the membrane that surrounds the yolk. And before I knew anything about eggs, when I'd crack them and I'd see this, I'd be like, oh no, there's like a chick in my egg, and I'd be stressed. But these are really good because they're more prominent in fresh eggs. They're definitely not a developing chick. They're basically like a bungee rope-like cord that holds the egg or the yolk centered in the egg or in your shell. So if there was a developing chick in there and the egg dropped and rolled, it would help prevent that yolk or that developing chick from hitting into the shell and damaging it. So it's a positive thing. And then as an egg ages, those chalazas start to degrade a little bit and the yolk starts shifting and it doesn't hold it anchored in the center as much. You won't see them as much when you crack the egg. But they are connected to the membrane that surrounds the yolks. So when you separate your yolks from your whites, they stay with the yolk portion and not with the whites. All right, so here you can really easily see the yolk, the thick albumin, and the thin albumin. I just wanted to point out that the American Egg Board has a really nice handout. So if you're ever doing a presentation on eggs and you want to give people a handout, they have this that talks about the different parts of the egg, and then they can match the name of the different parts of the eggs. This is just available on their website. As far as egg evaluation, eggs are evaluated on their size as well as their grade or quality. And so those are evaluated separately. The size is really just based on the breed of the animal, its age, its nutritional status, its environment, and the USDA has set standards for these. And you can see the standards are based on the weight per dozen eggs. So there's really just a 3-ounce difference per each dozen of eggs. Most commonly, what you'll see in the grocery store, extra large, large, and medium. But most recipes call for large eggs, and if a recipe doesn't indicate a size, it's recommended to stick with large eggs. When it comes to evaluating the quality of eggs, there are federal standards for evaluating the quality of eggs. And so eggs are evaluated based on the appearance of the shell, how uniform it is, how clean it is, if there's cracks, things like that, how big the air cell is. Again, they look at the whites, and if they have that firm, thick white, or if it's thin, if there's blood or meat spots in it. And then they also look at the outline of the yolk. Is it very apparent or not? Things like that. So eggs are either given a AA standard or grade, an A grade, or a B grade. In the grocery store, you'll only ever find AA and A. Grade B are used for frozen, liquid, and powdered egg products, but they're not sold in the grocery store. The AA and A are what you'll find in the grocery store. Really, when you're thinking about when you should use one or the other, AA eggs are best for things where shape matters. So if you're going to fry an egg and you don't want your egg to spread all over your pan, use a higher quality grade. So fried eggs, poached eggs, hard cooked eggs, it's more important for those. Or if you're whipping up an egg white foam, your foam is more stable if you're using a more fresh egg than a lower quality egg, which is usually an older egg. But other things where you're just going to mix the eggs up, like scrambled eggs or into a batter or omelets, it doesn't really matter if you're using a lower quality grade because it doesn't affect the nutritional content really. It doesn't really affect like the food safety of it. It's more of an appearance thing. So I'll kind of show you some pictures here. So you can see here with the highest grade, the AA, you can see the yolk is centered. You can really distinctly see that thick albumin versus the thin albumin. The egg's not spreading a ton. The yolk stands up tall and centered. As we go down a grade, you can see that thick white is thinning and spreading more in with the thin white. The yolk's not as centered, it's a little bit more flat. And with grade B, you can't even tell the thick white from the thin. It's just kind of degraded. The yolk is really flat. Your egg's going to spread a ton when you crack it. And the betalain membrane thins as well. And so when you try to separate your yolks from your whites, if you need to do that, the yolk breaks a lot easier. And so you can get yolk into your whites easier if you're using a lower grade. And so those are kind of the disadvantages of that. So how do we know the egg quality of what we got in our fridge? Well, you might start with a AA egg, and then you store it in your fridge for a whole month. After a month, those eggs that were AA are probably grade B by the time you use them, if you don't use them for a whole month. So it has to do with the length of storage. It also has to do with the temperature of storage. So if you store eggs at room temperature for a whole week, they're going to lose a whole grade. And so you want to store them in your fridge because that will keep the quality longer. And then, of course, the sooner you can use them, the better, because you're going to have that higher quality. But if you store them for a long time and you're just mixing them into a batter or making scrambled eggs, then it's not really going to be a big deal as far as the quality goes. When you're looking at your package and you're trying to determine, how old your eggs are, because sometimes you might want to know that, there's a lot of things printed on the package and it makes it a little bit confusing. So initially you might look to the September 25th and think, oh, that's how old they are, but that's the date that they want the store to sell them to you by. Then there's this P number, which is your plant number. So if you look this up on a website, you would be able to find where these eggs were packaged from. And then there's usually a 3-digit number. And this is a number that ranges from 001 to 365. So it's the 365 days of the year. So you have to figure out what was the 238th day of the year to determine how old those eggs are. So I looked it up, and it's August 26th is when these eggs were packaged. And so you have to look for that digit and then determine how old they are based on that 3-digit number. Just a couple more things. As far as safety goes with eggs can be contaminated with salmonella, and we could get that salmonella contamination through a few different ways. So it could be on the surface of the shell. So if the shell came in contact with the chicken's feces or whatever in the hen house, then it could have the salmonella on the surface. And you can wash the shell, and that way when you crack it, it's not getting from the shell into the egg and making you sick. It can go through the pores of the shell and get into the inside of the egg, or some chickens can have salmonella in their ovaries or through that oviduct, and so it can be contaminated with salmonella before the shell even forms. So you might do everything to sanitize the shell, but if you don't cook your eggs well enough, you could still get sick. So the USDA estimates that 1 in 10,000 to 20,000 eggs are contaminated in the inside with salmonella. So if you like your eggs kind of runny, or if you like to eat raw cookie dough, that's the chances you're taking. Are the eggs that you put in those, that 1 in 110,000 to 20,000 eggs, or are you one of the other ones that are totally fine? Of course, the USDA recommends that you cook your eggs to 160 degrees Fahrenheit. That means the whites are firm as well as the yolk being firm, and then you don't have risk for that salmonella. That's really important for elderly, or for pregnant or lactating individuals, or for young children, because they're at a higher risk of getting sick. You might not think that very many people get sick, but the FDA estimates that 79,000 cases of foodborne illness and 30 deaths each year are caused by eating eggs contaminated with salmonella. So people are still getting sick from salmonella in eggs. And so if you like your eggs kind of runny, or if you like eating a lot of raw cookie dough, that kind of thing, then just buying pasteurized eggs can be the safety net that you need, and then you don't have to have that risk or concern that you might get sick from eating raw eggs. So then I just had, as far as storing eggs, just so you are in the range, because a lot of people don't know how long you can store eggs. Really, if they're in the shell, you can store them for quite a while in your fridge, 3 to 5 weeks. And I know I've stored them longer than that, and they've been fine. In one of my classes, we look at older eggs just to see the effects on them. And so we've stored them for very long periods of time. And what happens is the inside pretty much kind of disappears as that air cell gets really, really big. But for the most part, most of us will use up our eggs in 3 to 5 weeks. And so that's a good range of time. Once those eggs are out of the shell, they're exposed to microbes in the air, bacteria in the air. And so you have a much shorter period of when you can store them, which is just 2 to 4 days. Same with liquid egg products or egg substitutes, about 3 days if they've been opened. If you've hard cooked eggs, so I think about Easter time, because sometimes people are really lenient with how they handle their eggs at Easter. If they've been at room temperature for 4 hours, you should throw them away. But if you've been keeping them at cold temperatures, you can store them from your fridge for 1 week, whether the shell's on or off. As far as egg-based dishes, though, only 3 to 4 days in the fridge is how long you should keep them. So as far as functions with eggs can participate in emulsions, like I mentioned. And so if you ever want to do demonstrations for your clients, different people that you work with, these are simple things that you could do to demonstrate an emulsion, which is 2 liquids that normally don't want to mix together. But if you add egg yolks, they contain lecithin, which is a phospholipid that binds to both the liquid phase and the fat phase, and it will keep those 2 liquids together. And so you could demonstrate that. Eggs also thicken products based on the fact that they are made of proteins. Those proteins denature and coagulate, which means they kind of unwind, bind together, and go from a liquid to a solid state. And we want to make sure we're only cooking our eggs to those temperatures, coagulation temperatures, because once you cook past that, too many proteins bind together. They squeeze that liquid out, and you have a really dry, rubbery, tough product. And so we want to cook them just until they're to that coagulation temperature. And so, again, there's a variety of different examples that you could teach people about when it comes to eggs thickening. You could do hard cooked eggs and talk about all the different issues that you might see with hard cooked eggs and how to prevent them. Easy things like fried, poached, scrambled eggs, omelets, frittatas. I always demonstrate omelets in my cooking lab in my class. And one semester, not too long ago, there was a boy in my class, and he started as dietetics major. By the end, he changed over to business. But he said learning how to make omelets has changed his life because I don't think he knew how to cook very many things. And this is a really quick, easy thing to make, but it always looks very attractive, and it's just a really filling, satisfying thing. So teaching people simple, quick meals like eggs can make so many quick, simple meals can really change people's lives. Again, custards, whether it's a stirred custard or a baked custard, another way to show the eggs thicken things, pie fillings. And then last, you can demonstrate egg white foams, how those are formed. I don't have a lot of time to talk about these. I'm kind of out of time. So, but you could demonstrate meringues, soft meringues that go on pies, or hard meringues that are more like your cookie candy type things, or a variety of different cakes that you could demonstrate. So lots of little simple, easy cooking demonstrations that you could do with eggs. And eggs are so cheap and people get excited. I hope they do. I get really excited about eggs, and I'm hoping other people get excited about eggs. So there's a lot of great things that you could do with them, and there's my references. Any questions? Any other questions?
This is Caleb. I've got a question about shelf life of eggs, going back to that. I know of a test, and I'm wondering to see how valid it is, of where you put the water. I've heard that if you fill a bowl up with water and you put the egg in, and if it sinks, it's still a good egg, but if it rises, that means the gas has entered into the shell and it's no longer a quality egg. How valid is that test? Are you familiar with it?
Yeah, and I've done it. So if it's really fresh, it will lay flat on the bottom of your bowl. And then as the air cell gets bigger, it kind of floats up. So it still touches the bottom, and then the top floats up where the air cell is. And then as it gets really older, the egg will actually float. So I think it would have to be pretty old for the egg to float, because I've used old eggs before and it just kind of sits up on the more narrow end. But if it had a lot of air in it, yes, it would flow in there. So it's a good way to kind of look at it. It's fun.
Thanks. We've got some requests of if we can get copies of your PowerPoint.
Yeah, for sure. And I have a handout with some recipes on it too. I could send if you want that as well. All right.
Okay, well, I'll speak on behalf of everyone that thank you so much for taking the time out of your day and presenting to all of us. I never knew there was so much to learn about eggs, and that it could all be so fascinating. And so thank you again, Stacy, for that. Yeah. And just a reminder, if you haven't already, put your name in the chat. But that's everything we have. Thank you, everyone.
All right, perfect. Thank you. And if you will, what's your last name, Caleb, so that I can send this email to you with the slides and everything?
Yeah, Harrison. So CALEB. Harrison at USC.
Okay, perfect. Okay, thank you.